upcoming election or whether they play a role, since I know at least in the Republican circles, the validity of the polls has been widely contested as kind of based on the results of the previous election, since they missed virtually everyone saw that a lot of polls missed Trump winning the 2016 election. And so I wanted to talk a little bit more about why should we care about polls and how do we ensure that a poll is accurate and consistent. And so I'm going to look in particular at one of the most popular websites that gives the presidential election prediction, and that is 538.com. They're making their own prediction. They've been making their own predictions, I think, since 2010 online, and they've made a prediction for the 2012, 2016, and 2020 elections, the upcoming 2020 election as well. And so I think looking at their methodology will give us some insight into how these polls are play a role in the election at all, right?
Yeah. Just to be clear, these are 538's own predictions and not the sum of other predictions.
Exactly. So, and I think that this is a good point to mention for all of our discussions and all of our segments, is that we do not necessarily agree with the opinions put forth by these people. We are just looking at the data and the arguments from a detached basis and seeing if they hold up to kind of rigorous analysis, right?
Yep.
So I'm going to share my screen now to see a particular article. And so this article is talking about an update for the pollster ratings for the 2020 general election. And so 538, in terms of poll quality, they actually have a whole grading system that determines whether polls have kind of high statistical significance or low statistical significance. And so that's represented in terms of a grade from, I think, A+ to F or C-, whatever it is. So in this article, they basically talk about whether we should be able to trust polls or whether they have been consistently missing results. So I think a couple of key points here that they make is that, yes, polls are not perfect because polls in general cannot represent every single person. Polls take only a sample of people, and so that goes into sampling bias, which later on in the podcast, we're going to talk a little bit about various kinds of statistical biases and how those can play in political elections. So as they say here, the absolute difference between a poll's margin and the actual vote share for the 2020 presidential primaries has been around 10 percentage points. And so that is, as they say, some of the biggest error in primary polling this century. And so I think it's important to attempt to describe this error and determine why it happens. But first of all, I would like to focus on the presidential election itself and whether presidential polls are more or less accurate, right?
Okay.
So if we look at I think a bit later, whether the polls actually pick the right winners, that is one of the most basic indicators of whether a poll is right. So if a poll predicts that Biden will win, we can look at whether it predicted correctly or not. It is a good indicator, but it's also a little bit of a flawed indicator, because if we have a very closely contested election, say in some of the battleground states, and one candidate wins by, say, half a percentage point or even like less than a percentage point, then the poll might get something wrong, even though the actual votes were really, really close. And so the poll actually, the accuracy of the poll is perceived to be lower than it actually is. But if we look at the data from 1998 to 2018, is that in general, polls have been accurate around 79% of the time, which is, I would say, a pretty good probability for just a 50-50 guess if you were completely guessing. It is also, you have to recognize, it's not perfect, but it is much better than random chance, that I will say. So, but if we look specifically at the general elections for the president, the polls were accurate 71%, or 71% of the polls were accurate compared to 82% 82% in 2011, 2012, 94% in 2007 to 2008. And so I think the figures are around in the same ballpark, right? So it is not out of the blue. It is not below 50 or above 90. So I think polls haven't changed much in quality in the past decades, right?
Sure.
Do you agree?
Yeah, this is actually highly interesting because it seems to me, and I'm sure it will seem to other viewers, that the vast majority of polls did not predict Trump to win in 2016. So that's
Exactly,
quite a
exactly.
surprising result.
And I was going to bring that up a little bit later, but I think right now we're focusing on poll quality, right?
Uh-huh.
So this is another chart that in which they show that some of the biggest mistakes that polls make are in close races, which makes a lot of sense, right? If even the people don't know who's going to be the candidate, then how can polls know, right?
Yeah.
So if the margin, the difference margin is less than 3 points, then in all races since 1998, only 57% of the polls have been accurate. While if you have a margin of more than 20 points, then they're accurate 99% of the time. So that clearly speaks to the fact that it's not necessarily some kind of machinations going on with the polls. It's simply that there is often some statistical error that you can't really tell who's going to vote. Is there some person that for example, wrote the wrong candidate that they're voting for in the poll, but then they're actually going to vote for a different candidate. So they do acknowledge that statistical bias can also play a direction, quite a large role in whether polls are accurate or not. But overall, I think one of the most important charts that I found was this one right here. And so it shows that polling bias in general is on average pretty small and also distributed equally, so it does not prefer either party. So for example, if you look at the 2015-16 presidential election, right, we have a general bias towards the Democratic Party of about 3 percentage points, right?
Sure.
And so a lot of people in the last presidential election, they kind of took it as an indication that the polls are lying and that the polls are favoring the Democratic side. But if we look at past elections, such as the 2011-2012 election, we see that in there, the polls actually favored the Republican Party by around 2.8 percentage points. And if we go back even further, we see that similar things happened in the 1999 election and then in the 2003 election. And so if we take the average of all these biases, what they do get in this final number at the end is that you get a very, very slight preference towards the Democratic Party. And so at that point, you might just call it statistical error, right? If it's only 0.3 percentage points, then I would not really say that the polls are biased towards either party, because in that case, you get something larger, such as, I don't know, 1 or even 2 percentage points on average. So I think that this chart does show. Sorry?
Because a lot of people tend to look at polls when they themselves are unsure of the outcome. So it's a little bit of a self-referential thing.
Right, exactly. And I think that's a good reason for why the actual biases over the years might be pretty high, but the average bias over the years might be pretty low. Because if the polls see that, say, for example, that Biden is winning, then people might be more convinced that Biden is winning. And then they would not say, when they were asked in polls whether that they voted Trump, they would say that they voted for Biden. And so that is kind of like a snowball effect leading to these relatively high numbers. But even then, I would say that 3 percentage points is relatively consistent. It's a relatively small error if we're looking at a poll of, say, thousands of people in many different states. Okay, so all of this basically goes into the 538 poll rating system, where they show how they whether they trust a particular poll or not. And so if you give me a second, I will show you. Zoom is being a bit annoying here, but we're going to get through it. Okay, so they go into a lot of detail here of how they ensure that a poll is accurate. But I think some of the interesting charts again to look here is which polls are actually the most accurate over the years. So this shows poll performance by simple average error, which again looks at whether the poll was right or not. And so we see across the board that generally polls have around maybe 3 to 6 percentage points of error. And I think the best one across the board is the ABC News and Washington Post poll, which has since 2008 and before 2008 up to 1998 had only around 3 percentage points of error. We do see, however, that some of the worst doing polls, such as Insider Advantage, have around 10 percentage error.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. So it does show that poll methodology does matter, and you can get very different results based on how you do things. And they acknowledge a couple of key factors that have changed since they did this first in 2010. So in 2010, they actually made the case against internet polls, saying that those will be very biased, and the way that you kind of market to people on the internet will encourage self-selection bias, where people from one party are selected or people from the other party are selected. But they've acknowledged that since the internet has grown and expanded so much in the past decade, then that is pretty much negligible at this point. And so they don't include an explicit penalty for poll quality as they did in 2010 now. And they also acknowledge now that it is very hard to distinguish a partisan poll from a nonpartisan poll. And so it is kind of a matter of definition. What do you define as a partisan poll? If a particular party is sponsoring the poll, is that partisan? What if they're actively kind of interfering with who's being polled? So those questions are much harder to answer now than they were before. And another thing that they do acknowledge is that there's something called pollster herding. And so that is the tendency of polls to be influenced by each other. So if a polling firm suggests that Biden might win and another one does that, and a lot of them do that, then a poll might be way less likely to come out with different results saying that Trump is more likely to win. And so that again can lead to a snowball effect where you have all of the polls saying that one candidate is going to win, while the actual reality might be a bit different. And so they go into detail on how they specifically analyze the data. So they collect and classify the polls. They make sure that all of them are unbiased. Then they calculate the average error based on percentage points. So again, if a Republican was to win by 4 points and he won by 9, that is a 5-point error in that case. Then they calculate the average of those errors using a pretty simple math formula. And then they do some variations on that reflect pollster herding, which they mentioned. And so in the end, they get this figure called, I think, predictive plus minus. And so the predictive plus minus gives you an indication of poll quality that they post on their website. So I think here's an example of their advanced plus minus figure. And we see that the green ones are the better ones. So ABC News and Washington Post poll, even by this calculation, they're very accurate compared to, say, again, Insider Advantage that has much higher figures.
Yep.
And so I think these in general give us a bit more indication that we are able to trust polls and that they are not necessarily biased towards any party in election. While we might get a pretty high error for this election, that is not systematic. It's going to be different in the next election 4 years down the road.